So most of you know, but I'll kind of quickly go into just basically the heart of what we do. We were established about 2007 as the Board of Supervisors began working on advancing a sustainable action plan for county operations. So we're internal. We don't, and that's why a lot of people don't really know about us. Although oftentimes we play a proxy role as a navigator or interface for members of the community working on sustainability and climate change to try to connect with the county on these topics. But our job is outlined in a Board of Supervisors resolution, which is to basically implement the Sustainable Action Plan for county operations. You can Google it, it's on our website. The most recent plan was updated in 2018, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But our job is to work with all the other 41 departments and 7,000 people at Pima County. We're a small, we're large enough to be a small eastern state, to try to improve sustainability in our own operations. And so that's what we do in a nutshell. And I'll kind of parse that out in the different areas of sustainability that we work as we sort of dive into the questions.
Thank you, Julie. So that's a simple mission to reduce, essentially, is it simply to reduce the carbon footprint of Pima County operations, or are there other aspects that you're trying to touch on besides carbon?
Yeah, so there are multiple aspects of that. One of the things that happened that was really fantastic is that what was not fantastic was when the U.S. pulled out of our Paris Agreement commitments to reduce collectively our nation's carbon emissions. The reaction to that by the Board of Supervisors and many mayors and boards around the country was to basically turn around and determine we're going to do it on our own, right? So the Board of Supervisors in 2017 passed 2 climate resolutions, and these are also on our website, the Sustainability Division's website. And what they mandated was that we rewrite the plan, we update the plan with a central focus on meeting the goals and targets of the Paris Agreement. So we had up to that point 3 iterations of the Sustainable Action Plan, and this one pivoted to focus on climate, both mitigation and adaptation. And so we looked at aspects of all our operations where we can reduce carbon emissions, but where we also need to start focusing on adaptation. And even though waste and recycling has been a long part of this process, we are now looking at it more through the lens of, if we can reduce our landfill waste, what is a carbon equivalent for that? So that's been the pivot and the focus of what we do. The current plan has 5 chapters, and within each chapter there are targets that the board, and with the participation of the lead department directors who have oversight responsibility for meeting these targets, all agreed to. So what our carbon emission targets were going to be in our buildings, in fleet, landscape targets. A new aspect of this adaptation piece was, how are we going to start to orient towards helping climate workforce be more resilient in the face of extreme weather events. That's a piece we're still developing. It's not fully flushed out yet. So those are some areas that we cover. Water conservation is another one.
So when you said the workforce more resilient in the face of extreme heat, I imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are city workers out on the streets we see. There are private companies workers out on the streets. We are concerned about them. The post office I was talking to a
Yeah.
postal carrier. She said that in her her station there were 60 vehicles. 2 of them were air conditioned, and this was in June when we were having that long heat spell, and she was throwing up every day.
Yeah. Oh
And,
God.
and one of her colleagues called her, and he sounded really bad. And she ascertained where he was. He was at a 7-Eleven. She said, "Let them in. Let them get you into the refrigerator."
Yeah.
And so they took him into the refrigerator room. He had to go to the
Yeah.
hospital. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of people in the county who are being affected now. Do you just weep at the side, or is there something you can do about that?
Well, I think so. There are there there is a chain of steps to get to a solution. And so one is why recognizing there's a problem and who's the most vulnerable. And the county has a large percentage of its workforce that do outdoor work. So folks that work in the regional wastewater reclamation department, in the Department of Transportation, and inspection service, food safety, and at flood control and parks. And anyway, it goes on and on. Landscapers, so a lot of people working outside that could be very vulnerable. So the county has for a while been, and I'm not part of this, so I'm kind of speaking secondhand, has been implementing training to help outdoor workers recognize the symptoms of heat exhaustion. So that's part of a training that's going. But what we want to do as part of the Sustainable Action Plan, and the acronym is SAPCO. So if I throw that out, that's what I'm talking about. Is there's 2 parts of this. We want to start to integrate this into a culture of awareness and preparedness in all county workforce, whether you're sitting in an air-conditioned office like I am, or you're working outside. And the workforce preparedness part is based on a seasonal type of training around the events or conditions that can happen related to climate change. So it's not just summer and heat, but there are other aspects to this throughout the season. So we want to get that as a mandatory but informational and frankly fun type of training, because people are more likely to want to be involved. The other part of this is we want to implement a type of training that is for all the county workforce that helps the workforce actually act as a diffusion network in the community. So the training is focused on home preparedness. So how do you keep your family safe at home during extreme weather events? What's your kit and your checklist and your emergency plan? This is really familiar territory for people who've come from outside of Tucson here, from earthquake country and hurricane country and tornado country. This is sort of normal. But we don't have the same training for climate change here in Tucson. And this sprung out of the recognition that there's been work done that in a climate-related emergency, there is a certain percentage of the county workforce that needs to show up at work to keep the lights on, keep operations running, support emergency management, get buildings up and running, deal with floods, all of those aspects. But one of the barriers to people being able to do that is often feeling comfortable they know their family's safe or their loved ones are safe. So by helping all of us at the county workforce be prepared in our homes, we start to push that information out to our friends and family. We can show up to work when we're needed for an emergency. That probably won't be me, but many of my colleagues, who work at the Office of Emergency Management will need to be on site, and maybe for days on end. So those are the 2 pieces that we're doing, and we're putting together a training team to develop this. It involves staff from the health department and staff from the Office of Emergency Management, and hopefully some staff from U of A's School of Public Health.
So this will be a training that has not yet begun, but you are right now putting it together.
Yeah, exactly.
And the goal is all 7,000 workers eventually will participate in that
Yeah,
training.
yeah,
Now,
exactly.
is that something that you would like to see implemented elsewhere in the area, like through the city? Or?
You know, my kind of way of going about things is to try to pilot a model first and learn, you know, get a set of lessons learned, and then push that out to a broader community. And so fingers crossed, you know, we have a good training and it works really well, and we do a good evaluation and know what the outcomes are. And then by all means, push it out, give it to anyone who wants to use it and improve it, right? Feed information back to us.
Are you in touch with the Physicians for Social Responsibility on this matter?
So my inspiration is drawn from Barbara Warren and Physicians for Social Responsibility. I got to work with her very early on the Climate Smart Southwest project.
Great.
And so I'm very deeply influenced by all her work and commitment, and all the folks who worked on that project and continue to volunteer their time.
Nice. Well, there's so many things to ask, but I'd like to take a little turn and ask you about a personal beginning.
Yeah.
Do you have a memorable moment or two that led you to the environmental and social awareness that informs you now?
Yeah, I really like that question, and I jotted down, you know, and I think there have been many things, you know, I think as we journey through our life, we'll, you know, if we're paying attention, we try to, you know, we'll have moments that, you know, our awareness is really opened up to a certain issue. And I think the sexual equity piece has been with me for a long time, as growing up in Tucson and traveling to Nogales, Sonora, and other parts of Sonora, and just becoming exposed to communities who lived with a lot less and in a state of a degraded environment. And so that just stuck with me, you know. But I think, you know, one of the most memorable experiences I ever had that really was a turning point for me was when I was younger, and I was living in the Virgin Islands, going to college there. Um, and there was an environmental event that happened where the dominant sea urchin population of the coral reefs there basically had a mass mortality event / extinction event literally overnight. I mean, it wasn't quite literally, but one day you were diving on the reefs and there were sea urchins, which are herbivores, which graze on the coral reefs and control the algae growth. So it's a really necessary sort of key species in the health of coral reefs. One day they're all over the reefs. The next day you wake up and you go down to the ocean and their skeletons are called tests, and they're just scattered everywhere on the seashore. And it just, I will never forget that instance as becoming acutely aware that extinction tipping points can happen in a blink of an eye. And that even as a human species, we may not always be paying attention. That was a very dramatic moment where that led to a phase shift in the composition of coral reefs throughout the Caribbean. So that was my personal experience.
Did you ever learn what caused that sudden die-out?
There's been a lot of discussion, debate, research, and I don't think the issue has ever really been settled. You know, there's a whole range of ideas. And at the time, frankly, it was so unprecedented, and the science and the ability to mobilize science to do investigation in that moment was much more constrained than probably what we'd be able to do now.
And do you remember a thought or a few thoughts that you had, like you saw this happen, you were shocked, you were disappointed? Was there a
Mhm.
thought, a decision that you took away from that?
I think for me, it was horror and deep sadness, and just a realization that we um, we collectively as human beings living and operating on this planet with these other major systems and species and diversity, we can have a profound impact, and we have to take a much better position or role in stewardship.
And that's what you're doing now. Trying.
Trying.
Well, speaking of that, we'd love to hear what one or two major accomplishments that you feel especially good about in your work,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's recent or some time.
Yeah. Well, I think, I don't do my work in isolation. So what's really important, I think, is, and a lot of my work is sort of behind the scenes, and it's really subtle. It's like nudging and nagging and, you know, and then congratulating people for doing the good job when they can get to that space to do it. Um, but when we were able, and there were members of my department here, in particular Jenny Neely, an attorney, and then through support of the community, who showed up at the Board of Supervisors meeting to speak on behalf of the climate resolutions. I think that was a big step, and that felt like real progress, because it really gave us a mandate. And what was I think really important about those resolutions, especially the second one, which was 2017-59, was the establishment of a set of targets, and goals and objectives that we were responsible for reporting out on. So that was a big push. And since then, working with community on projects around food systems, and the other pieces, which we haven't really talked about, that were associated with those resolutions, now part of SAPGO. Our fleet services is doing this amazing job of integrating electric vehicles and bringing those online and supporting that at the county, trying to scale up the EV charging infrastructure. So what's really key about the things that I just described is that many people that are joining me on this call, that I can't see your face, have been part of this process too, even though they may not necessarily feel like it, because these are communication and discussions that have happened in these community forums and informal meetings and community driven action. And so initially you get to this point where you get like a tip, and you get something like a resolution, but there's a lot of groundwork that happens up to that point. And so it's a lot of this work is really informed by the community, like Barbara Warren and Physicians for Social Responsibility, and being a pain in the side of our local utility and to try to get things done. So,
Well, what are you trying to get done with local utility?
well, so a couple of things have transpired from when I started my position to where I am now. When I started, not long after I started, the county lost its energy manager, and we didn't have one for almost 2 years. So I did a lot of early work in my job as sort of wearing two hats, helping on the energy management job responsibilities, along with my colleague at that point, Alex Oden, who was an amazing energy analyst. Many of you know him as well. I mean, I have to give credit to all the work he did in the early energy analytics for the county that what provided the foundation for us to move forward on some of the climate work.
Julie, is he not
But
with you now?
no, Alex moved on about 2.5 years ago. He's working for the family firm.
Ah,
So anyway, so yeah, Alex was huge in this work. And now we have an energy manager. So I've really stepped back from a lot of that. But the most recent work on the energy side that I have probably been directly involved in was the TEP IRP process. And that was really nice to have the space to work, although, I mean, that was an imperfect process, and who was invited to sit at that table, but it was at least some people invited to sit at the table. And there was a really internal effort to work with our cross-departmental team to try to help identify what the best of the so-called energy portfolios TEP was putting forward, and what we were going to support. And we were really able, I think, in that process to move forward a lot of topics and needs that had sort of been held off the table for discussion.
Now, you've used a couple of acronyms that I think would be nice to know more about. Earlier you mentioned SAPCO, and then you just now spoke about IRP. I'd love to hear more about
Right. So that's TEP's integrated resource plan, which they update every 2 years. And the integrated resource plan is not it's a policy document that TEP provides to the ACC to explain how they're going to integrate renewable resources into their portfolio of energy assets, and what that is going to look like in terms of a composition, and what their goals and objectives are to bring more renewables online, and what the cost is going to be to the consumer, and what the best type of renewables are to bring on. And this last round, they also brought in scientists from the U of A to develop, and what was integrated was that U of A's effort to develop a science-based target for what TEP needed to include as renewables for their portfolio. So all of that together, I think, helped move the needle forward more than it had in years past. And the city was involved, other towns, some community organizations were involved, and then the U of A.
So that was your cross-departmental effort there, was to work with them?
That was one of them, yeah. So internally, there was only 2 of us sitting on the panel at the TEP IRP, but internally we had follow-up meetings that involved fleet services, facilities, wastewater, and county administration and sustainability. So, I keep coming back to the term operational, but we really look at everything through an operational lens of not only what, and my role really is to then find that space between the operational lens and what the science is indicating what the greenhouse gas reduction targets need to be. But between those spaces, there's how are you going to get there? And that's where it's really, really important to have operational folks as part of the conversation, because they understand buildings and HVAC systems and wastewater treatment and vehicles, and how you get all these things going to serve the needs of a public. That's my opinion.
It sounds as though a big part of your work then is getting people together
It is.
and essentially facilitating the discussion, holding the party. And then
That's it.
do you also do a lot of note taking and kind of tracking of here's what I've heard so far, that kind of process governance?
Yeah, a little bit. We always take notes, and we always work off an agenda. We have certain focus items on the agenda, and then we, like any group, occasionally we sort of get pulled off course or in the weeds. But by and large, I have to say our operational folks here at the county are just super. I mean, they're really expert professionals. And so as long as we can have the space for them to come together and a translational piece, right? So, we have engineers and architects and hydrologists and biologists, none of them are trained necessarily to speak the other's language. And then you layer climate science and all of that. So the process is really evolves around, okay, there's agreement that we have to get here. How internally do we do that? Where can we look? Where are our targets? And where are some of the constraints and barriers? Like there are many constraints and barriers about where it makes sense to site solar. And lo and behold, who knew? You can't put ground-mounted solar in a floodplain, and you can't put, and so there's many layers of complexity when you really start to get into these discussions. And without the experts at the table, you can waste a lot of time sort of chasing threads that don't have a real connection to how to operationalize it.
It's a very vivid image, chasing threads.
Yes.
So just to make sure, it sounds like this big accomplishment you're very happy about was getting these resolutions from the Board of Supervisors. And then in particular also, sounds like helping TEP be more ambitious in their renewable energy goals. And are there some measurables there that you have? Like I know they got measurables for reducing carbon output by county operations, but do you have measurables on these?
On the IRP process?
Sure.
Or the TEPs?
Right.
Yeah, I did. I can't pull it out of my brain because it's been it's been a while.
Okay.
But I believe, and I could be wrong, that, or at least for a while, TEP had published all of their portfolios on their website, which in and of itself to me was a big breakthrough. And the portfolios showed, the portfolios were basically modeled scenarios that showed if we bring, we cut this much coal and we bring this much type of renewable on under a timeline, and what the cost will be and what the greenhouse gas emissions will be. There was, I think, ultimately 14 portfolios, and they started maybe with 5 or 6, and they took requests from that committee saying, we want to see this version. And we're very accommodating in running those scenarios.
So what do you feel now are some unfilled gaps in your work?
In my work at the county, well, I think we need let me go back in time just a little bit. So when we in 2017-18 built SAPCO, at that point, the U.S. nationally determined contribution to meeting the Paris Agreement was to reduce national carbon emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels, I believe. I may be close, I may be off a little bit there, but I think that's what it was. And basically we calculated internally what that would be. But that science even at that point was telling us that's not sufficient, right? And so we did the exercise of calculating what 50% below 2005 levels would be. And so that's in our action plan. We've got to get to 50% fast, as everyone does. And I guess what's really missing at this point, as I can't speak for other jurisdictions, but for the county, we need to move more quickly. And we need to figure out how to do that. And there needs to be, some sort of pressure, frankly, to realize that we really have basically three and a half years left of our plan, and we are not doing well. We are not. We did well in bringing fleet vehicles in, but we are not doing well in cutting our carbon emissions.
Mm.
And how do we fix that? How do we get it sped up? And I think, COVID, frankly, as it's unfortunate that it has taken so many resources and such attention to dealing with that crisis that everything else has just taken a second seat. So now we have dueling crises, right, that are heading towards us, or in our world. We have climate change and we have COVID. And my biggest fear is now we're pushed into that window, which was predicted, that if we didn't take early action on solving the climate crisis, we're going to be in reaction mode, spending all our resources in dealing with catastrophe. And so I really feel like we're on this fine edge that if we don't make the needed change quickly, we're going to be going down this spiral of just throwing money at disasters and not really addressing the core issues of solutions.
And so what do you think, Julie? You say we need to figure out how to get there fast. There needs to be some sort of pressure. What do you imagine that
Yeah.
would be?
Well, I've been wrestling with that question a lot lately. I've been wrestling with it a lot lately. And I think it's very layered. It just depends on who they are in that, right? So if it's the county, then the county needs to be reminded that, yes, COVID is a disaster, but this is also a disaster. And we have to meet our commitments. And if it's, more regional, or if it's national, I frankly have not spent a lot of time in recent months diving into the details of the infrastructure and the Biden plans. I'm semi-optimistic that there's enough in there to get us going, but I don't know that there is enough, and it's going to happen quickly enough to move the needle the way it needs to happen, so that as we make this transition between jobs and the economy and sources of economic and infrastructure investment, that's going to translate into benefits for people who need it the most. And so it's like we're running multiple foot races at the same time.
And just based on what you've been centering on, it seems like the climate crisis is the most overwhelming issue that we're facing in your estimation.
That is my opinion. Yes, that is my very strong opinion. That it is going to touch. It is touching almost all of us now. Where even, I mean, just an anecdote. I think maybe 5-6 years ago, I gave a presentation and I was inserting some pieces of climate related to the work we do here. And I asked the audience, how many of you felt like you've been personally touched by climate change? And, a few people raised their hands. And then maybe a year and a half ago, I gave another talk and I asked the same question. It was just like this, right? So the reality is with us. Um, but I think what remains to be seen is whether we're going to navigate quickly enough the type of transition that's required.
And you're looking at a small representation of the kind of people who are called concerned citizens or even engaged activists. And
Yep.
what would you ask us and all those who are unseen tonight, what would you ask us to do to help you step things up? How could we strategically assist?
Well, first, thank you for that question. And I so appreciate you bringing the conversation back to that point, because I think it's very easy for all of us to lose sight that we have some piece in this, or we do have some power in this, right, to bring about some change. So let me just say first, I am going at the end of this month, I'm stepping down to a part-time role and will be handing more of the reins off to my coordinator, Sandra Mina, and who is a climate scientist. And very focused, did her master's work on adaptation research in Southern Louisiana. So super sensitized to these issues and keenly motivated to be involved in solution building. And she's also our analyst. So she's the person that crunches all our data for the reports. So I'm going to step down. I'm going to part-time the end of this month. And then within 6 months, I will be moving out entirely, in part because I am sort of internally realizing that that I am burned out and that there needs to be some fresh, vital energy in this chair to keep the pressure on, right? Keep this work going because of the time urgency. So, and that is a really great transition that's in the work. So that I'm not sharing that to be, that's a negative in any way. It's a really good positive. So I would say, as Sustainable Tucson has reorganized and revitalized, and they have these subcommittees that are doing this work, continuing to engage with your elected officials in really strategic ways and leveraging up the collective work of different organizations that share the same goals. It can be, this doesn't always happen, but it can happen where organizations, the aim and aspiration and goal can get lost sometimes in the different approaches to solution. Whereas by bringing some of these forces together, maybe everyone has a slightly different version of what the solution looks like. But by focusing on initial part of that solution is to come together to be a bigger unit, bigger strength, to help engage and positively work with the elected officials to make this a priority if you feel the same way. If you feel this is, the issue of our age in the crisis that by science measure it is, then that is, I think, one of the most powerful things that can happen. Because as you know, and those of the folks on this call and the training you've been doing is that elected officials take their direction from the public. and county and public servants in the county and the city take their direction from elected officials. So it becomes a nice circular chain of really keeping attention on priority items. The other piece of this that I would add is that there are going to be trade-offs with this work. It's going to be expensive. And a lot of the so-called low-hanging fruit has been done. And certainly some of the infrastructure pieces do have a good and relatively quick return on investment. But there are other pieces of it that don't. And so starting to build a framework for dialogue around understanding the cost benefit trade-off, but the benefits are not immediate, but building a better future. And the thinking about the way this conversation can be framed so it's not all just about raising taxes or losing things, about gaining things. And then the last piece of this, I would say, is that we need more diversity in the conversation in a really, really urgent way. I don't think we're going to get where we need to get unless there's a better diversity representation, people of color, women, different genders involved in advancing the conversation, because we have for the longest time been a very kind of white demographic of sort of stereotypical view, tree huggers, do-gooders out there trying to do this work, but that only is one kind of sliver of the view. And so we really we need to find ways to invite or join others in their efforts to broaden this conversation and view, because then it becomes full circle. Then we see the whole picture of costs and benefits.
Thank you, Julie. That's a lot for us to digest and to act on. I think you'll be pleased to know that our next monthly meeting will be October 12th, which is Indigenous Peoples Day. And we will be addressed by Penelese Droz, who's a Native American scholar in Indigenous perspectives on sustainability as one of her interests. So we're doing what we can, and we hope to be doing better. Now, I'd like to open the field to folks who are here. It's a small enough group. If you just want to unmute,
I'd like to first thank Julie. Let me take this off so I can hear myself.
And while you're doing that, technicality.
Thank you really from the bottom of my heart for all the hard work you've done in the years you've been there. I remember when you left the climate communications arena and came and took this position. It was a little more hopeful time, and you've accomplished an enormous amount, and I really appreciate to the extent you've gotten in the weeds about many of the deeper intersectional issues, let's say, involved. And I'm really happy that you're moving on. I had a real health crisis a couple of years ago, and stepping away from everything was very important, and it helped me really focus on what is the last thing I can do in my life. And I think time away will give you the kind of perspective and relaxation to really see what that calling may be. And I'm real hopeful for that.
So while we're waiting, we'll make a couple of announcements. The first one is that Julie's been talking a lot about process, and working with people in a collaborative way. This Saturday, our sustainability ambassadors will be meeting with Bonnie Colby, a professor at UA who works with graduate students on collaborative problem solving with diverse stakeholders. And she'll be sharing some of her approaches, some of her ideas about that. If you're interested, you can contact anyone you know in Sustainable Tucson. I'm Stuart at sustainabletucson.org. Many of you know Trace. And it'll be Saturday morning, and you would be welcome as a guest.
Yes, sorry about that. Very sorry.
Yeah, that was quite an exciting turbulence in our airstream here. So, Julie, I'd like to invite if Roger or Danye or CJ have a question, or Trace for that matter. I would like to remind people it's really a time to ask questions. Julie came to be with us, and our role tonight is to simply elicit and converse.
Yeah, actually, I would like to ask a question of Julie. You talked about connecting with our elected officials. Presumably that also would include our county elected officials and keep them on their toes. Are there other ways in which those of us who live in the county could get involved with anything that would sort of help further things along?
Yeah, thanks, Paula. And again, you know, just that is just such a great question. So because, unfortunately at the county, because my side of work is focused on internal operations, I don't have that direct mechanism. I mean, of course, I can always have a conversation or, you know, have a meeting, but the way for me to be able to channel the community or citizens into facilitating change within operations is through the elected side and through organizations. So that is the best channel, and it can be really, you know, I know it sounds a little dry, and I know many of you have spent an enormous amount of time cultivating relationships with elected officials and meeting with elected officials. But I think the key thing to think is not just sort of a one and done, right? It's an ongoing relationship that you build with your elected official. And sometimes that question that you've asked me, what can I do to help, is maybe one you pose to them because they're under a lot of work and strain. And so they may have an idea, but need to hear that question. And you know, that's how relationships work, right? It's, you know, being there for others and then hoping that others can be there for you when you need help.
Okay, good, thanks.
Thank you, Julie. I'm not sure you heard, I mentioned that we're having a session on Saturday morning. Did you hear that part?
I heard that, and then I lost, and I heard a little bit of Bob, and then I lost most of Bob. Sorry, Bob.
Okay, great. Well, you are, to think who it was now, there was a famous person who said, relations are everything.
Yeah.
It'll come back.
Yeah. Yep.
So what have you found helps you to cultivate good relations with the people that you work with?
Well, I think, well, my strategies, I'm not sure this is the strategy for everyone or every place, but I spend some time up front trying to understand more about the person I want to build a relationship and what their role and responsibility is. And so when I finally do get some time FaceTime or whatever with a person who, for instance, a director of a department at the county who has, you know, could have maybe a dozen staff under them or a couple of hundred staff under them, you know, just understanding first, you know, that they've got a lot on their plate, but trying to move the conversation to a space of inviting their involvement in solving the problem, not just coming with rigid solutions, because I'm not the expert. I'm, you know, it took me, frankly, a while to learn that, you know, if I'm having a conversation with an engineer, or I'm having a conversation with an architect or a biologist, I am not the expert. But I can bring awareness to an issue and invite them into the conversation about maybe how we start to think about what a solution would be from their expertise.
So coming in essentially with an understanding of what some issue or issues are, and inviting their perspective versus saying, here's what I want you to do.
Right, right, yeah. And that's been really, really helpful. And the other part of this is to celebrate successes and share the achievement, invite others into the space to take credit for their part of that achievement. In sustainability, this is another thing that took me quite a while to learn, is, you know, sustainability depends on a whole bunch of other actors coming into the space to work with you on solutions. And one of the, given a typical type of hierarchy or bureaucracy, that type of effort is not incentivized or rewarded normally. And the people that donate their time typically then don't get to come away with a, you know, I did this, I solved this problem. It's like, we solved this problem. But even in that we have to create space so that fleet services gets to, you know, shine, and PDEQ gets to shine, so that everyone is acknowledged, because a lot of time and energy and work went into solving that problem. So it doesn't work in every situation, and there, and typically, you know, I guess I'm repeating myself, but a lot of hierarchies and bureaucracies are not oriented towards that type of collaborative problem solving workspace, and so it takes time to build that space. It takes trust, and then it takes willingness on my part or other people's in that space to also support those other partners when they need something or need a help. So if somebody calls me in my organization and, you know, can you work on this, or can you give me some advice about that, even though it doesn't have anything directly to do with what I'm doing, I really try to make time to respond.
And I wonder, do you have any particular project or moment in a project where you saw this happening and you saw a result come out of that?
I saw it a lot in the reverse for a long time. So I was like, maybe my problem is not getting enough solar panels. Maybe my problem is getting the right people at the table to talk about the right way to get solar panels, and that actually have the authority to get solar panels. So there was a lot of sort of entering into this backwards, but I think ultimately, like, a success would be, there've been many, but a recent one that a lot of folks on this call will relate to, and this goes back to Climate Smart Southwest. So this all ties to all of you folks on this call who participated in Climate Smart Southwest. One of the key findings of that work of that group was the lack, identifying a lack of planning around emergency shelters and cooling centers for extreme heat. So as we were coming into this summer and I started to build some relationship with the health department, I started raising this issue. And it turns out one of the problems is that issue doesn't fit in anyone's wheelhouse, right? And so the frustration I was feeling was sort of misplaced because it didn't fit. And so it was about creating a space here to bring people in and with some high level, a little dose of high level, thou shalt do this, you know, get together and figure this out. So we're making progress on that. We have a long way to go, but that was sort of an example, I think, of time will tell, but making progress forward.
I'd love to know more about that because I've been working with a neighborhood resilience group that started in San Hughes, and we've got now a subgroup called System Resilience, where we are actually talking to people like Tucson Water and TEP and saying, so what is your readiness? And what's going to happen if we have a power outage that lasts 2 weeks? How are you going to supply, and so on? And so I would love to know about this group that you've got, or what you're doing in public health.
So I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. I will share that right now it's very much a formative group.
Okay.
And the group, in my opinion, is not ready to, and I don't mean this is me speaking from my experience of having worked internal to operations and trying to gauge at where the readiness of a group of people will be to engage with the external partners. And sometimes if we push that too fast, the whole thing can blow up a little bit. So the state of it right now is I have several departments working, but we have several departments working together. Keep important people are at the table. We have support from the health department. We have some involvement from the UA School of Public Health. And we're really, again, we're focused on the operational piece right now because that's what's in the wheelhouse. That's what people have their hands around. That's like, we know how to build a GIS map and we know how to do these different pieces. So we're getting it up, but as practitioners, sustainability practitioners and advocates, we all know that the other piece that often doesn't happen is then this connectivity to the community, right? And the community has lots of really good ideas built on direct experience working with neighborhoods. And so I've raised this topic a number of times and they're not quite ready. So I think they need to get a little more momentum, a little bit more structure under their belt. And then this other piece is how do we put this together in the hands of the community so they can use this tool and help inform it as well through development. Does that make sense?
Well, my mind is going so many places as you're talking. I didn't track it all, but I tracked a lot. And so, yes, let's talk at another time.
Okay.
Get more about
Now,
that.
let's make that a three-way conversation because I'm trying to get some information from TEP on their capacity to address some of these issues.
Right.
As well.
So the piece that we're working on right now, so here's another strategy that I've sort of developed. Again, this is something that works for me. I'm not saying it's the best solution for every environment, but when you're tackling an issue within an organization and the issue doesn't fall smoothly or neatly in any one department's wheelhouse, keeping it chunks down to some pieces that folks can get their hands around. I frankly, I used the scary scenario to get folks' attention, right? The one that we all worked on in Climate Smart Southwest. We have a grid failure. We lose water in 72 hours. Store shelves are empty. What are we going to do, right? No one entity can solve that problem overnight, right? It's overwhelming. So the piece that I'm working on with my internal collaborators, okay, first of all, let's figure out what emergency shelters are and what cooling centers are and what the capacity and where they are and what they serve. And do we need to train staff who might likely be librarians how to wear two hats in a crisis? So those are the very operational pieces that we're working on. And that's the way I found that I can interface with my colleagues that respects, because I'm not the expert. I have to respect that I'm asking them to take on a whole other piece of a challenge that's not part of their work. And so it's going slow, but we're making progress. And then this piece on the broader community, how do we build resilience to prevent the type of grid failure catastrophes we've seen over and over with climate extremes, whether wildfire, hurricane, snow event, how do we start to deal with that? But yes, by all means, we'll all sit on the phone and talk.
That would be fun.
Yeah, just a comment, Julie. It appears to me that none of the solutions to any of our problems fit neatly within the bounds of whatever the responsibilities are.
Right.
And so,
I think that's largely true.
And go ahead.
And I would say in defense of my colleagues who are very hardworking, trained professionals, that's not what they were trained to do. That was not part of their education. That was not part of the structure of the organization they joined. And they weren't hired to deal with climate change. They were hired to be, deal with floods or, buildings or things like that. So it's, putting yourself in the shoes for just a moment. And I know it's hard because we get really, really, really frustrated because, we're running out of time. But putting yourself in the shoes of somebody who has a very strong disciplinary training and background and has a very specific job task and is not incentivized or allowed even to sort of step out of that box, then heaping on that person or that group of people this whole monumental challenge with no resources to deal with it, it's no wonder things aren't working very well, right?
So that's where what you're doing comes in, and that's where you're also asking us as citizens to get in there and be encouragers and reminders and reinforcers, so that people can't forget that what we're dealing with, and also
Right.
so they know they've got support.
Exactly. I more and more I feel that is a big piece of this work, right? Of being a good listener to the constraints and the boundaries of the either elected folks are working with or staff are working with. Not to get stuck there. I'm not saying that that's, we hit that wall and we stay stuck, because that's basically where we are right now, right? But that there is, and I'm hoping there is space in the future that we will embark on the process again. I don't know this will happen because there's been some pretty disastrous examples in the past in our community of, these task forces that involve public, private, academic convening of dialogue, right? And what's happened a lot in the past is they've they haven't been very successful in the sense they haven't yielded the results that we had all hoped they would yield. And that's a whole other conversation why that might be. But I would suggest that if going forward, if there was more space like that, and the goal wasn't set rigidly at the beginning to, we're going to have a plan, we're going to have a policy, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, county, you got to do this, but more of a dialogue. Hey, these are the resources I have. This is what I can bring to the table. What are you guys working on? Maybe, maybe there's a place to crosswalk these two things.
Julie, do you think that most of your the other staff of the county understand the limits that they're operating under?
Oh, that's it's a good question, Trace, and I think it's a really hard question to answer because, 7,000 employees, right? I would say some do and some don't. I could probably count on my one hand the number of staff that really have sort of any interdisciplinary training, and the rest do not.
Julie, this is the beginning of a perpetual conversation, or maybe rather, this is the middle of a perpetual conversation. But I'd like to be kind to you for the time you've taken, and we all need to get to our nightly affairs. So I'd like to say on behalf of all those who were here and those who left when we had our technical meltdown, that we so appreciate. And as Bob said at the beginning, thank you for all you've done. And let's talk soon about the resilience issues that we've all got in our minds.